Hello folks, in this guide for Khazan, we will be comparing all three weapon types and helping you decide which one is best for you. We'll start by looking at what stats each weapon relies on, the playstyles that each weapon suits best, and then we'll take a look at their overall pros and cons, as well as briefly looking over their skill trees. We don't cover the specific skills much here, but if you would like something more specific, then I do have a range of much more in-depth guides on the channel. We are keeping things quite simple for now, but this guide is nonetheless absolutely rammed with information, so let's get started. Beginning with dual wield, we'll first take a look at what stats we need for this weapon and how they inherently affect our playstyle. Now, it goes without saying, but everyone will rely on vitality and endurance, regardless of weapon choice. These are core stats. Without vitality, you won't be able to take many hits, and without endurance, you will struggle with stamina management. The main damage stat for dual wielding is willpower. This will increase damage the most. Next would be strength. Willpower also heavily affects both guard stamina damage decreased and stamina recovery, meaning you will inherently gain better stamina regeneration and your stamina will decrease less when blocking. Meaning, with time, dual wielding will slightly lean more towards a blocking playstyle as opposed to dodging, but dodging is still very viable. As a general rule, both strength or proficiency are to be ignored until much later on in the game, if at all. Of course, this is just optimal advice. Feel free to do as you like. Now, as for the dual wielding playstyle, at its core, it's the most combo intensive weapon in the game. It does simply have longer combos it can perform. It strikes a nice balance between the other weapons, offering a blend of both weighted attacks and speed. It typically leans more towards single target damage, and some of its better combos can take some commitment to get out. However, given this weapon's short attack animations, it does create plenty of opportunities to either dodge or block incoming damage. Range is an issue early on, but once you unlock more skills, it will become less of a problem. As a general rule, you are typically right in the enemy's face with this weapon, and it does require slightly more from the player than the other two weapons do, given that it simply requires more inputs than the other two weapons, mixed in with the constant need to either reposition or guard incoming attacks, and that can become quite intensive. With that said, it sits right in the middle in terms of damage output. It doesn't hit as hard as the Greatsword, but it's very fast and has some solid options to burst attack enemies, and it does slightly outmatch the spear in damage. It struggles to stagger enemies without using some of its better skills, but a handful of these skills do also provide invincibility frames or counter potential, and there does appear to be more of these options available for dual wielding than either of the other weapons. Now, to take a brief look at the skill trees, there's an awful lot going on within the penetrate skill tree, which basically focuses around dodging. Typically, these skills fall in with dodging offensively, each dodge offering damage and follow-up options for additional damage and stagger potential. Blocking may be preferable due to stat allocation, however, dodging will be required to stay on the offensive. A basic way of viewing this is dodging with your attacks to stay mobile and out of harm's way whilst racking up damage. Once stamina is low or enemies begin throwing out overwhelming attacks, it's likely time to play a little bit more defensively instead, holding positions and focusing on guarding attacks until a new window of damage appears or you're able to counter. As mentioned before, there's a range of skills here that offer either brief invincibility and or solid counter attacks, meaning despite some of the dual wield's limitations with range and its intensive playstyle, it does appear to offer more high skill ceiling options that can really turn a fight around or get you out of a bad spot. Overall, you'll be focused on sticking to enemies, weaving long combos in and around guarding or dodging, with a slightly bigger focus on guarding. What you lack in range, you make up for with speed and counter potential, but this is the most click intensive playstyle, and in my opinion, dual wielding offers the hardest experience within Khazan. Moving on to the Greatsword, we'll first take a look at what stats we will need for this weapon and how they inherently affect our playstyle. Now, it goes without saying, but everyone will rely on vitality and endurance. Regardless of weapon choice, these are core stats. Without vitality, you won't be able to take many hits, and without endurance, you will struggle with stamina management. The main damage stat for the Greatsword is strength. This will increase damage the most. Next would be proficiency. Strength also heavily affects received stamina damage decrease and max weight, meaning you will inherently have a higher max weight and generally receive less stamina damage when taking hits, making Greatswords more capable than any other weapon at taking a hit. As a general rule, both willpower and proficiency are to be ignored until much later on in the game, if at all. Of course, this is just optimal advice. Feel free to do as you like. Now, as for the Greatsword's playstyle, at its core, it's the slowest weapon in the game, but it is by no means a slow weapon. It takes the top spot of hardest hitting weapon, and rightly so. Where this does slightly lack in speed, it certainly makes up for and sheer stagger potential and damage output. The flip side to these strengths are the Greatsword also has some of the longest attack animations in the game. Long wind-ups and overcommitment means it can easily be misplayed. To offset this, however, the Greatsword generally has a range of skills that increase poise and damage resistance. Poise is the stat that dictates how likely you are to be staggered by an enemy whilst you yourself are attacking or charging an attack, making the Greatsword very good at trading damage with enemies and or allowing for mistakes. Additionally, the Greatsword requires the least amount of inputs out of all of the weapons. Combos are generally shorter and made up of large charged attacks as opposed to flurries of multiple blows. To add to this, a Greatsword is typically the most stationary of the weapons. It moves around the least and has a larger focus on butting heads with enemies as opposed to weaving through them. As previously mentioned, the Greatsword attacks generally hit very hard and they deal the most stagger damage in the game, meaning this weapon can and will consistently keep enemies off balance. Combining all of these factors together, and I'd argue that the Greatsword offers the most forgiving playstyle within Khazan. It may be the most rigid and slowest of the weapons, however, again, it is by no means a slow or rigid weapon. It just appears to be when compared. Now, to take a brief look at the skill trees, there's a huge focus on increasing poise and damage resistance, generally making it easier for the Greatsword to secure its damage. Additionally, there is a focus on combining charge attacks together, increasing the speed of charge attacks and allowing the Greatsword to become much more fluid. Unlike dual wielding, there isn't much here for invincibility frames. Instead, the Greatsword leans a little more into sheer counter potential, with its guard skill tree focusing a lot more on countering or dishing out damage whilst blocking through the enemies. Due to the Greatsword's inherent lack of movement, some of the spirit skills are very useful for closing gaps and or sticking to the more mobile enemies and bosses. Additionally, there is somewhat of a focus on skills that help further diminish the enemy's stamina bars, making the Greatsword fantastic at simply holding its ground whilst completely destabilizing the enemy. Overall, you'll be focused on standing your ground, countering enemy attacks and shredding stamina bars to make securing some of the longer charged attacks without any issue. With a bigger focus on trading damage with enemies and or allowing for mistakes, what you lack in speed, you more than make up for with how hard you actually hit. And due to these factors and the Greatsword's inherent survivability, I would say the Greatsword is the easiest experience within Khazan. Finally, we have the spear. We'll first take a look at what stats we will need for this weapon and how they inherently affect our playstyle. Now, it goes without saying, but everyone will rely on vitality and endurance. Regardless of weapon choice, these are core stats. Without vitality, you won't be able to take many hits, and without endurance, you will struggle with stamina management. The main damage stat for the spear is proficiency. This will increase damage the most. Next would be willpower, but until proficiency gives back diminishing returns, willpower should more or less be ignored. What I mean by this is when proficiency starts rewarding less than 2 damage per level, willpower would actually be more valuable to level at that point. Proficiency also heavily affects dodge stamina cost decrease and stamina damage increase, meaning with time, the spear leans a little more into a dodging playstyle over guarding, and additionally, you'll become better at draining enemy stamina bars, making it better at staggering enemies than dual wielding, but it still doesn't outmatch the Greatsword. As a general rule, both strength and willpower are to be ignored until much later on in the game, if at all. Of course, this is just optimal advice. Feel free to do as you like. Now, as for the spear's playstyle, at its core, it's the most mobile weapon in the game, offering the fastest playstyle due to its focus on movement and fast, rapid attacks. I think it slightly outmatches dual wielding in terms of speed, due to some of its attacks being very fast jabs with the spear itself. Adding to this, the spear leans the most into using attributes on weapons due to how often it hits and how often you'll be able to proc these effects. The flip side to the spear's superior movement and rapid attacks is its sheer reliance on stamina. Stringing together long combos will require some degree of skill. Additionally, positioning is key. Weaving through fights is only as effective as your overall positioning is, and mastering this will take some experience. Now, to offset the reliance on positioning and high movement, the spear also has the best range and generally strikes the best balance between handling single targets or groups of enemies. It definitely finds itself taking the top spot for being the most technical weapon in the game, offering a higher skill ceiling than that of the Greatsword, but less so than dual wielding. Its damage and stagger potential seem to be better than dual wielding is, and its movement is definitely better than Greatswords, defining the spear as the most mobile and technical weapon in the game. I would say, given all of this, the spear offers the middle ground of difficulty within Khazan. Now, to take a brief look at the skill trees, there's a nice blend of both skills that focus on invincibility, countering enemies, and adding additional stagger potential. In all fairness, it's a very solid skill tree, not really lacking in any particular quality, and it does everything quite well. There's tons of options, further adding to the spear's overall highly technical nature, rivaling dual wielding to some extent with its skill ceilings and long intensive combos. There's not much else to say here without getting very specific to the skills themselves. Overall, you'll be focused on movement and positioning, weaving through fights and dancing around enemies, whittling away stamina bars and ultimately keeping yourself out of harm's way, plenty of fast attack options and plenty of range to further increase survivability. What you lack in power, you certainly make up for with stamina damage and the sheer number of options available during combat. I would say the spear offers quite a difficult experience within Khazan, maybe not as tough a challenge as dual wielding, but definitely requiring a slightly higher mastery level than that of the Greatsword. That's it for this guide, folks. I do hope this guide was useful, and of course, I do have a range of growing guides over on the channel, so do feel free to stop on by and check things out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, folks, and until next time, peace.